Imagine a few tiny crystals resting in the palm of your hand. They sparkle faintly in the light, sharp-edged and white, like fragments of glass or snow. Place one on your tongue, and at once a flood of sensation fills your mouth. Sharp, biting, then warm, then strangely satisfying. Salt. A taste so ordinary now that we hardly think of it, yet so essential that entire civilizations have risen and strained under its weight. Today, you can walk into any kitchen and find salt in abundance, poured from a shaker, scattered over food without a second thought. But once this little mineral was worth its weight in silver. Once it was fought over, traded across deserts, and worshipped in temples. To run out of salt was not an inconvenience. It was a matter of survival. Tonight we will follow salt on its long journey, from the first crystals gleaming on ancient shores to the great caravans that carried it across the Sahara, from the hands of emperors who taxed it to the kitchens of today, where it seasons nearly every meal. A pinch of salt connects us to the deepest past and to our present lives, one grain at a time. Long before cities and empires, before writing and monuments, humans discovered salt. They found it at the edges of drying lakes, where sun and wind left behind crusts of gleaming white. They followed animals to natural salt licks, outcrops where deer and cattle licked the earth for its minerals. The taste was strange at first, but soon it became clear. This was not only pleasant but vital. Salt made food last longer, and it gave the body strength. In ancient Egypt, salt became part of daily life and eternal death. Farmers gathered it from the Nile Delta, scraping it from dry marshes and riverbanks. In their kitchens, it flavoured bread and fish. In their temples, it became sacred. Most of all, it was used in mummification. To preserve the body for the afterlife, priests packed it with natron, a natural salt mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate. Without salt, there was no preservation, no chance of eternal life. The dead depended on it as much as the living. Travel east and you find salt again in early China. By 6000 BCE, people were boiling brine in clay pots to harvest crystals. Entire communities grew around salt springs and wells. Over time, the Chinese perfected salt extraction, inventing technologies centuries ahead of their time. By the first millennium BCE, they were drilling deep wells into the earth, using bamboo piping to bring brine to the surface. What had begun as scattered crystals on the earth became the foundation of state power. And still further, across the Mediterranean, salt flavoured the lives of the Greeks. They offered it in religious rituals, sprinkled it over sacrificial animals, and used it to preserve olives and fish. They understood its value so well that they traded salt as a form of currency, passing it from hand to hand as we pass coins. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was survival. Without it, meat spoiled in days. With it, fish could last through long winters. Without it, the body weakened. With it, armies could march and ships could sail. To eat without salt was to eat in fear of hunger. To possess it was to hold a piece of security. Picture a family in an ancient village. The evening fire burns low, and a pot of stew simmers quietly. Into it goes a pinch of precious salt. At once the flavours bloom, and the food will nourish not just for tonight but for days ahead, stored and preserved. That small gesture, sprinkling a few grains, is a thread that connects them to us across thousands of years. Salt crystals glittered in the earliest dawn of civilization, and humans quickly learned that these simple grains were anything but ordinary. They were life, preservation, power, and even a glimpse of eternity. As villages grew into cities and cities into empires, salt followed like a shadow. It was never just a seasoning, it was wealth, stability, and a tool of control. Wherever people gathered in large numbers, salt became the thread that held society together, and often the chain by which rulers bound their subjects. In China, salt was already more than food. By the time of the Han Dynasty, 2,000 years ago, The state realised its power lay not only in armies and land, but in the white crystals drawn from salt wells and pans. Taxes on salt filled imperial treasuries, and the trade of brine across provinces became a lifeline of revenue. For generations, rulers funded roads, walls, and soldiers with the money collected from salt. To taste food was to taste the empire's hand. Far west in Rome, salt seeped into the very language of life. Soldiers were often given part of their pay as an allowance for salt, called a salarium. From that word comes our modern salary. The Roman roads that stretched like veins across Europe often led to salt works or past salt markets. To march was to rely on salted meat and fish, preserved so it would last weeks under the sun. Roman armies moved not just on discipline, but on salted rations. Across the Sahara, salt became so precious it was traded ounce for ounce with gold. Picture the desert, endless dunes, the air shimmering with heat. A long caravan winds its way forward, camels burdened not with jewels but with slabs of salt hewn from mines deep in the earth. These slabs, stacked like treasure chests, move from Tagaza and Taudeni to the markets of Timbuktu. There, in shaded stalls, merchants weighed salt as if it were silver, exchanging it for gold dust, ivory, or slaves. In West Africa, to own salt was to own life itself. In medieval Europe, salt gave rise to entire cities. Salzburg in Austria, his very name meaning salt fortress, grew rich on the mineral flowing from alpine mines. Towns in France and Germany owed their fortunes to brine springs and pans, where seawater evaporated under the summer sun. Salt built cathedrals, paved streets, and filled royal coffers. Imagine travelling those salt roads, carts creaking under their loads, guards marching alongside, merchants bargaining in crowded markets. Salt touched every layer of society, from the humble fisherman preserving his catch, to the emperor calculating his taxes, to the caravaner risking his life in the desert. It was, in its own quiet way, the fuel of civilizations. Empires could not march, cities could not feed themselves, and markets could not thrive without it. Salt was invisible, dissolved into soups and stews, yet it held more power than most visible treasures. By the Middle Ages, rulers across the world understood: control salt, and you control people. Taxes and monopolies on salt became as common as the mineral itself, and when those taxes grew too heavy, salt would spark unrest. In time, revolutions would rise over something as small, as ordinary as a pinch of crystals. But before rebellion, there was survival. Salt was the quiet guardian of food, the protector against hunger. It was the difference between a meal that lasted one day and one that lasted a season. To understand this, we must follow salt into the kitchens and cellars of history, where it saved harvests, sustained sailors, and shaped the rhythm of daily life. Salt was not only wealth for rulers and merchants. For ordinary people, it was the difference between hunger and survival. Before refrigeration, before canning or freezing, there was only one reliable way to preserve food: salt. Grain might keep on its own, but meat, fish, and vegetables spoiled quickly. With salt they endured, through winters, across voyages, and along the uncertain paths of trade. In the north, the Vikings mastered this art. Their longships cut through icy seas, carrying warriors and traders alike. On board, barrels held salted fish and meats, food that could last for weeks in the damp and cold. Without salt, no journey of conquest or exploration would have been possible. Salted cod, in particular, became a treasure. Dried and preserved, it could travel across oceans, feeding armies and colonies, far from its home waters. Medieval Europe lived by the same principle. Imagine a village in autumn. The harvest is in, the livestock are slaughtered for winter. Without salt, the meat would rot within days. With it, cuts of pork and beef are rubbed, packed into barrels, layered with brine. Fish are salted at the docks, stacked and stored until spring. Families depend on these stores. A failed salt supply could mean famine when the snow comes. The herring trade tells this story best. From the Middle Ages onward, Herring filled the North Sea in such abundance that it seemed endless. Yet fresh herring spoiled almost at once. Only with heavy salting could the catch be packed into barrels and shipped across Europe. In the towns of the Low Countries, salting herring became an industry so large that it funded fleets, built cities and fed distant markets. Without salt, the riches of the sea would have been lost in hours. Sailors knew this better than anyone. On long voyages, salted beef and biscuits were daily fare. The meat was tough, often sour, but it kept men alive through months at sea. The body craved not only calories but salt itself. Sweat in the hot sun drained it, work demanded it, and without it, health faltered. Salt was as necessary as water. Think of the sailors setting out across the Atlantic, barrels rolling into ship holds, filled with salted fish, salted pork, salted everything. Their survival depended less on the stars guiding them, and more on the invisible crystals clinging to every bite of their food. Even inland, the story was the same. A farmer's cheese preserved with salt could last through the year. Pickled vegetables steeped in brine carried families through lean months. Salt sat in kitchens not as a luxury, but as a guardian, an unseen protector against hunger. And so salt shaped rhythms of life. When salt was abundant, people thrived. When it was scarce, hardship loomed. Its preservation powers made it not just a flavouring, but a shield, against time, against decay, against famine. For centuries, the fight for salt was not about taste at all. It was about life continuing past the season, about journeys made possible, about survival itself. Salt did more than preserve food, it preserved authority. Rulers learned that whoever controlled the flow of salt could steady a treasury and tighten a grip on their people. A pinch on the tongue became a hand on the purse, and in time, a spark for revolt. In medieval and early modern Europe, the lesson was clear. Kings and councils claimed the right to tax or monopolise salt, turning a daily necessity into a steady river of coin. No levy was more infamous than the gabelle in France. It varied by region, confused merchants, angered peasants, and reached into every kitchen. To cook without salt was unthinkable. To season with it was to pay the crown. Over centuries, resentment salted the soil of France. Stories spread of smugglers slipping along forest paths with sacks of illicit crystals, of poor families stretching brine to avoid the tax collector's knock. By the late 18th century, the gabelle had become a symbol of arbitrary power and inequality. When the French Revolution broke upon the land, it swept the gabelle away. Proof that even a grain of policy can grow into a mountain of grievance. Elsewhere, city-states and empires built their fortunes on salt gates. In Italy, proud maritime republics managed salt pans and markets with a bookkeeper's vigilance, balancing ledgers as carefully as captains trimmed their sails. Along the Adriatic and across the Mediterranean, salt warehouses rose like fortresses, timbered beams, cool stone walls, orderly stacks of barrels. Each barrel was a promise of revenue, of control, of winter bread. To keep that promise, authorities patrolled coasts, counted loads, and watched for the quiet, patient figure of the smuggler. Sometimes the people's anger boiled over. In Moscow in 1648, a hike in the salt tax to fund state expenses set the city alight. Crowds surged through the streets, petitions turned into shouts, and soon officials were dragged from offices and punished in public fury. A mineral that could calm rot had stirred riot. The tax was pared back, but the memory lingered, a bitter taste that outlasted any statute. And far to the east, salt remained an arm of the state. In China, dynasties had long understood the mineral's fiscal magic. Licenses, monopolies, and transport routes formed a lattice of authority that spanned provinces. When the system was well managed, roads were repaired, granaries stocked, soldiers paid. When it grew corrupt or brittle, the burden fell on those least able to bear it, and trouble followed the brine. In the modern age, the most famous challenge to salt power came not with swords, but with bare feet on a long road. In 1930, in colonial India, salt was taxed and tightly controlled by the British Raj. The sea itself was near, the sun hot enough to crust the shore with white, and still Indians were forbidden to gather what nature left for free. Mohandas Gandhi chose this quiet injustice as the field of non-violent battle. He walked for weeks with companions to the coastal village of Dandi. There he stooped, lifted a lump of salty earth, and broke the law with a gesture so simple it rang across the world. Others followed. Women boiled seawater in iron pots. Villagers scooped crystals with calloused hands. The Salt March did not topple an empire in a day, but it revealed the fragility of an authority that claimed dominion over the sea's edge and the people's table. War, too, placed salt in the sights of strategy. Armies that depended on preserved rations targeted the enemy's salt works and storehouses. In sieges, salt grew scarce, lips cracked, and tempers frayed. In civil conflicts, raiding parties struck evaporation ponds and boiling houses, knowing that to spoil salt was to weaken resolve months later. The mineral that kept food from decay could, when denied, help decay a cause. Through all of this, kitchens remained the final theatre. A mother in a stone cottage, a labourer in a crowded city, a sailor's wife by a windy harbour, each measured their lives in handfuls of salt. When the price climbed, meals thinned. When the law pressed, neighbours whispered of back roads and friendly shopkeepers. When a distant protest began over a white crust at the sea's rim, people listened with their stomachs as much as their hearts. Salt's power was never loud. It did not glitter like gold or dazzle like silks. It dissolved into soups and stews and vanished from sight, leaving only its certainty behind. Precisely because it was ordinary, it could not be ignored. And when those in high rooms forgot that, history reminded them, with riots in city squares, with new laws penned in haste, with quiet acts of defiance beside a patient sea. Now, as the world industrializes and markets knit continents together, the fist around salt begins to loosen, yet the memory of its grip remains. In the next and final chapter, we return from palaces and protests to the present day, to mines deep underground, to iodized shakers on kitchen tables, to pink crystals on restaurant slabs, and ask how a substance once measured like treasure became the most familiar speck in our lives. In our time, salt no longer glitters like treasure, nor travels with caravans across deserts. It is everywhere, stacked in supermarkets, spread on icy roads, poured without thought from small glass shakers. What was once counted and taxed grain by grain has become so ordinary we hardly notice it. Yet salt remains as essential as ever, woven quietly into nearly every part of life. Modern salt often comes not from small pans or desert mines, but from vast industrial works. Deep underground, miners carve tunnels into ancient seas trapped in stone. Imagine stepping into one of these caverns, walls glittering like frozen frost, air dry and cool, corridors stretching endlessly, lit by electric lamps that catch on crystals embedded in rock. Machines cut and haul the blocks upward, where they're crushed, refined, and packaged. What was once gathered by hand with baskets is now moved by the ton in roaring trucks. In other places, salt is drawn from the sea just as it was thousands of years ago, though on a far greater scale. Wide evaporation ponds spread like mosaics across coastlines, shallow pools coloured pink and red by algae that thrive in brine. The sun and wind do their work, leaving behind crusts of sparkling crystals. Workers rake them into heaps, a scene nearly unchanged from antiquity, except that the heaps now rise higher and feed conveyor belts that lead to factories. From these sources, salt takes many paths. One is familiar: the fine grains of table salt, often iodized. In the early 20th century, governments realized that adding iodine could prevent goiter, a disease caused by deficiency. This small adjustment, invisible to taste, improved public health on a global scale. Every sprinkle on eggs or soup carries not only flavour, but medicine, a quiet reminder of salt's place in the balance of the body. But salt also travels to less visible destinations. In colder countries, millions of tons are spread each winter across roads, melting ice and snow. Without it, highways would freeze into danger, cities would stall and commerce would halt. The same mineral that once guarded fish in wooden barrels now guards cars and pedestrians against winter's grip. Salt shapes industries beyond food and safety. It is used in making plastics, in softening water, in producing chemicals, even in certain medicines and cosmetics. In each, its role is quiet but vital, hidden inside processes most of us never see. The world runs on salt as much as it seasons with it. And still, salt inspires the imagination of cooks and eaters. No longer limited to white crystals, we explore pink Himalayan salt, delicate flakes of sea salt, smoky crystals from volcanic shores. Chefs sprinkle them like jewels over dishes, not for survival but for beauty, texture and taste. What was once simply survival has become art. Yet even in this abundance, echoes of the past remain. Salt is still political, still environmental. Heavy use of road salt corrodes bridges and seeps into rivers. Salt mines sustain communities but scar landscapes. And in parts of the world, salt remains a measure of survival. In regions where scarcity persists, a sack of salt can still be worth a week's labour. Think again of those crystals resting in your palm. They no longer represent the wealth of empires or the trigger of revolts, but they carry the memory of all those things. When you shake salt over your meal, you repeat a gesture as old as humanity, one that has bound us together across deserts, seas and centuries. Salt today is both utterly ordinary and endlessly extraordinary. It no longer decides the rise and fall of empires, but it still shapes health, industry and daily life in ways both visible and invisible. From underground caverns to shining restaurant tables, it remains what it has always been, a substance that preserves, protects and connects. Our journey with salt now settles, like grains sinking slowly to the bottom of a glass. We have followed it from the first shining crystals on ancient shores, through deserts and empires, into kitchens and protests, and finally into the shakers and sacks of our own time. Salt has been treasure and tax, survival and symbol. It has preserved bodies and food, stirred revolts and prayers, softened roads and sharpened flavours. And yet, in your hand tonight, it is only a pinch. Small, ordinary, quiet. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those grains resting in your palm, slipping through your fingers like sand, vanishing into the silence of the night. With them fall the weight of centuries, the long marches of caravans, the whisper of markets, the memory of revolutions. Only calm remains, like the gentle taste of salt on the lips. And tomorrow, when you lift the shaker or sprinkle a pinch into your food, you will know you hold not just seasoning, but history itself. Good night.